We have officially made it to video number 5, halfway through our cold process soaper transformation series. Assuming you guys are leaving me questions that I can answer in video number 10 of the series. Hint, hint. If you have some questions, please leave them below so I can make that last video really tailored to everything that you guys need to know that I didn't cover. Okay, let's get into today's video. We are solving all of the soap problems that you may encounter while making your cold process soap. Now, if you just randomly appeared here because you searched like a problem that you were having while making soap, I did put chapters down in the description so you can quickly skip ahead to whatever section you may need. But if you're a part of the series and have skipped around, I highly recommend, of course, going all the way back to the beginning and watching those videos first. Here we're just going to be reviewing different soaping problems that you may encounter while making, how you can prevent or avoid them, and things to look out for in the future to make it a little bit easier and more predictable. Of course, there is no exact science here. You are from time to time going to encounter problems, so let's talk about how we can fix them if they occur. And of course, I did add extra information into the downloadable PDF guidebook, including a link to my fragrance oil review sheet, which is normally just accessible through my Patreon. And that has soaping notes for all of the different fragrance oils that I have tried, because as you will find during this video, usually if you're having a soaping problem, the culprit is your fragrance oil. And it sounds like this bird is just going to be chirping throughout the background of the video. I'm not sure if you guys will be able to hear it, but he's there, and every time I say something, they chirp. I guess we're having like a little conversation, a little audience for today. Hopefully you don't mind. Diving in with the problem that I see most often or frequently in myself in soap making is called split tops. Now, this means that as your soap has dried and you take it out of the mold, you might see there are some cracks across the very top layer of soap. This happens when soap is solidifying within your mold, okay? So you have your silicone mold with your wooden box around it to help keep its shape. There's nowhere for this heat that's happening inside of your bar to escape except through the top, because everywhere else is kind of covered, right? So the best way to combat this is to rest your soap raised off of the flat surface that it is on. You could use like a baker's drying rack. You could use the burners on your stove top. Just rest it in an area where air can flow through all sides of it instead of just the top. That should solve this problem for you. Now, if you still see this problem occurring, it's really only aesthetically an issue if that bothers you. I've never had anyone say anything to me about it. Again, it does happen to me quite often. And no one's ever said anything to me about it, but I understand how, it can make you feel as a maker who wants everything to be perfect. So it's still totally safe to use, and there's nothing actually wrong with the bar itself. It just got a little hot while it was drying. All right, before we dive into anything else, I want to cover two things: trace and acceleration. They are very often grouped together, but it's important to note that they are actually two separate things. When you are bringing a soap batter to trace, that means that you have combined your oils and your lye water solution into, one bowl, and you've mixed them together. Once they have all combined, that's called trace. This is not a problem. There's no troubleshooting to be had here. I do often see people categorizing trace as a problem in your soap, and it's not. It's actually part of every single soap you will make. It's just a part of the process. But what can happen is, depending on the oils that you choose and the fragrance oil that you choose, sometimes that trace happens faster and sometimes it happens slower. So the problem occurs here when you have mixed everything together, you've hit trace, but it starts happening really, really fast. By the time you've realized that your soap has accelerated, it's really hard to pour. Batter has accelerated too much and it's hit that point of looking like pudding. You can still use it and it will still make a great bar. You just have to work very quickly to kind of scoop it, and I've used spatulas before to spoon it into your mold because it likely won't, it'll be too thick to pour. So you just have to put them So you just have to use a spoon, scrape it into your mold, and work really hard to tap out those air bubbles. I normally put like a rolled up towel on the counter and then just bang it on the counter a couple of times to get those air bubbles out. If you do this, then your soap bar will be totally fine. Okay, there won't be anything wrong with it, and you've tapped out the air bubbles, so there won't be like chunks of soap missing. This does become a problem though if you are trying to do like an intricate design. If you want to work with a swirl, it is a little bit harder to work with. You just kind of have to let Jesus take the wheel on that one. But if your soap does accelerate quickly, you can still make a really great bar. Sometimes when you bring your oils and lye to trace, what can happen is they will rise or separate. Now, again, these are two things that I often see, or two terms that I often see used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Rising, it really is kind of self-explanatory. Actually, technically both. Actually, both are really self-explanatory. Rising will happen after you mix and you pour your batter into a mold, and instead of it looking like a smooth texture, it will look like little pieces of rice are in your soap. It'll look clumpy, okay? So you can combat this by continuing to mix with your stick blender or a spatula. I personally use a spatula when this happens. It's more work, but you're able to control the outcome more so than using a stick blender. Stick blenders are going to bring something to trace a lot faster than mixing by hand with a spatula. But what happens when it mixes faster? It accelerates, okay? So you do have to be aware that that can occur if you're using a stick blender. Again, the best thing to do here, mix by hand to try and get your texture as smooth as possible. If you're mixing by hand, you're likely not going to be able to get it as smooth as you typically would, but it will be a better outcome for you and your soap bar won't be ruined. Now, on the opposite side of mixing too much is not mixing enough, which is the separation that we talked about earlier. If you don't mix your original oils and lye solution together enough, then they will separate and not form a new bar. Unfortunately, if this is the case for you, you won't know until a couple of days later when you try and unmold it and it falls apart. I have been there before. Trust me, it hurts my feelings very much. So to put all that effort into it only for it to fall apart when it comes out of the mold. Unfortunately, if this happens, there's not really much you can do. You can try and rebatch it, but that doesn't always fix the original problem, and it's not going to give you a viable bar that you can actually use unless you successfully rebatch it. And truthfully, it can still separate even if you mix it plenty. Sometimes that's just the way that the soap crumbles, if you will. So if you encounter separation, I would go back to the drawing board. If you notice as you're pouring your soap into your mold that it has started to separating, just stop there. Don't continue to pour it into the mold. What you can do is you can put it in a crock pot and heat it like super low, like heat it low until everything has melted again, and then you can remix and try again. And then you can remix it and hope for the best. Now, this may not end up being your prettiest bar, but it's salvageable and you can still use it. Let's talk about fragrance oils. As we've covered throughout this video, typically if you're having a problem making your soap or you're encountering any of these issues after making soap, typically the problem is your fragrance oil. Speaking of problematic fragrance oils, the final kind of troubleshooting piece we're going to talk about today is discoloration. So when you use fragrance oils, they react very differently in each soap recipe, unfortunately. Speaking of problematic fragrance oils, you'll see 9 times out of 10 if you're having a problem that it is because of your fragrance oil, and discoloration is no exception. Sometimes when you make a bar and you unmold it, you're surprised at the outcome. This can mean that the fragrance oil has turned your soap brown. It has changed the color of the mica powder that you have added into it. It's gotten this weird yellowy hue to it, or the entire color has disappeared from the bar. That has only happened to me once, and it was very creepy. I actually have this video here that shows you know, that entire process happening because I filmed it as the making vlog. So you can definitely check that one out. It's a very interesting it's very interesting when the color just totally disappears. So what you can do to kind of try and help out with your discoloration is choose a reputable supplier. Reputable suppliers where you order your fragrance oils from will often have pictures in their product descriptions that show how the soap discolors or changes color throughout the curing process. Something else that they will have is a vanilla content amount. The more vanilla in a fragrance oil, the more it will discolor. Generally, it will discolor like a yellow or a brown, kind of like we talked about earlier, but it can randomly change other colors as well. Another thing that I do before purchasing a fragrance oil is I check the reviews. Trust me, you can learn so many things and save yourself wasted materials, heartache, time, the whole shebang if you read those customer reviews. Okay, people are brutally honest in their reviews. So you'll be able to see if a fragrance oil is behaving well, if it's a dream to work with, if it's terrible, if it riced, if it changed color. Sometimes even the fragrance itself can change as it goes through the process. So reading reviews is really going to be your best bet. Now, what I did was I created a fragrance oil spreadsheet. On this fragrance oil review spreadsheet, I put a bunch of notes each time I try a new fragrance oil, and it's like separated by supplier. So if you're like, oh, I really want to order from Dupe Fragrance, you know, you can go to the Dupe Fragrance page and search through the fragrance oils that I have used and see how they behave in cold process soap, because sometimes you think it's going to be one way and it's not. So the more you read and prepare before you start, the better the outcome will be, which I feel like is typical with anything, especially handmade hobbies. Purchase the PDF guidebook, then that will come for free. And it is like a growing one. So each time I try one, I do add it to that spreadsheet. But for baseline, the lower the vanilla content, the better and easier it will be to work with. Something else that I have read several different places but have not tested myself is if you're trying to slow down the trace of a soap batter, is to use citrus type fragrances because they slow trace down, which I found very interesting. All right, very briefly, we're going to talk about gelling and then we're going to hit the road. Gelling happens no matter what you do, okay? So don't think a lesser vanilla content is not going to help you here. So gelling just really naturally occurs. There's nothing wrong with it. You can still use the bar, but it does change like the overall look of your bar. So once you pour it and it is in the mold solidifying, what will happen is some of the soap will gel. Oftentimes what happens is the entire bar doesn't gel, or the entire loaf won't gel, because the temperatures around the outer edges of your soap will cool a lot faster than the middle. So the middle will gel, and it really, what it looks like is it's kind of more like transparent than like a creamy look like the outside of your bar would be. This is actually really easy to solve. I do it with all of my bars. All you really have to do once you pour it into the mold is I wrap it in a towel for like the duration of its drying. This can cause cracks on the top. The very first problem that we talked about at the beginning of the video, because the temperature gets so high, it can cause the crack on the top. It doesn't happen every time I do it, but it does happen sometimes. So just be aware that, you know, solving one problem can cause another. Again, the gelling is just an aesthetic thing. The bar is still totally safe to use. It just might look like it has like a little ring in the middle of it. Overall, I would say when in doubt, check the reviews for a fragrance oil, because that's going to be your very best way to prevent any of these things from happening. Coming up in video number 6 of our series, I'm going to take you back into the kitchen for another tutorial. That is going to be, I would say, like a middle of the road swirling technique. It's not like the most technical, it's not super advanced, but it is quite a step up from our original tutorial. If you want to do that with me, I included the list of materials and ingredients that we're going to use in the PDF guidebook. Otherwise, you can wait and watch and write everything down and come back to the video afterward once your supplies arrive. While you're waiting, I have these two videos here. The first one is a real life look at different soaping problems that I have encountered and what they did to the bar that I had at the time. And this one over here is, I would say, an untutorial. It was supposed to be a tutorial, but the soap ended up separating. So that's a great look at how soaping can turn out if you don't mix it all the way. I'll see you in my next video.